Hey guys, I've been tossing around the idea of doing an individual review of my WR250R for a while, so I figured I'd just hop on it and get it done. Right off the bat, I'm just going to tell you that this is the best bike that I've ever owned, in my opinion. But I don't believe that I have a bias on it. There are things that I think this bike could do better, but the things that I think the bike can do better are probably not the first things that come to mind when you guys think of the negatives of this bike. Before we dive into this, I'll just give you guys a little bit of background about myself. I'm 6'7", 280 pounds, so I'm by no means a small guy at all. I've owned a KLR 650, a KLX 650C, DRZ 400S, and currently own an Africa Twin. And I've ridden a TW200 for my motorcycle course, a DR650, KLX 250S, CRF 250L, CRF 450L, XT 250, DR350, KLR 250, KTM 525 EXC, KTM 300 XCW, YZ250F, and the list just goes on. So I'm by no means a stranger to dirt bikes and dual sports in general. So I feel as if I'm in a good position to vocalize my opinion and tell you what I think about this bike. Now, moving on to the actual review. Starting off this review immediately, I'm going to talk about ergonomics. The easiest way I could describe how this bike feels sitting on it is that it sits like a very narrow KLR 650. For a guy my size, this bike actually works really well. It's much more comfortable than this DRZ in stock form, and out of all of the dual sports I've ridden, even a lot of dirt bikes, this bike is much more comfortable. And now, I'm going to make a very bold claim and say that this bike is hands down the best dual sport ever made. I know there are bikes out there that perform better, but those bikes are extremely high maintenance compared to this, and they cater much more to dirt style riding rather than road style riding. They really don't do well on the street. The WR, for instance, has a lot of plastic dampeners. It has a much heavier counter shaft to kind of smooth the vibrations out. The motor on it is much smoother than what it would be on a dedicated dirt bike. And all of those things add up to a much better road riding experience, and this is especially true for prolonged trips. And I'm also aware that there are bikes out there that are cheaper that might do the same things, but those bikes just don't have the same level of performance that the WR250R does. And not to mention that, but the range of capabilities on those bikes just don't compare to the sheer capabilities of the WR. The WR is just a much better road bike and dirt bike than a lot of the dual sports on the market right now. And that's one of the things that makes the WR so special as a dual sport. This bike rides and handles very similar to a dedicated dirt bike, yet it has maintenance intervals of 3,000 mile oil changes and 26,000 mile valve adjustments, which is just absurd. The majority of street bikes that you have do not have valve adjustments that long, and these motors are proven to stay in spec and to handle the abuse that people give to these bikes. It's just incredible. With that being said, there's only one other bike that comes to mind when thinking of the WR250R, or this class, I should say, and that would be the DRZ 400. But the DRZ 400 has a few very big flaws, in my opinion, that just completely opted out when compared to the WR250R. The first one being the gearbox. The gearbox on the DRZ is terrible. How it's geared is just not good for dual sport riding. It's good for dirt bike riding, but it's not good for dual sport riding. The motor vibrates a lot more, and because of how it's geared much lower, when you're on the highway, the DRZ is just screaming and it's vibrating like crazy. So on long trips, well, even just half hour to an hour trips, my hands are completely numb from the handlebars vibrating so much. Then there's the fact that it's also carbureted, and me living in a temperate climate, and also this would be a big deal with massive elevation changes too, but I go out on a 30 to 40 degree morning and go to start my bike, and I would have to choke the DRZ for a good 40 to 50 seconds just to get it started, and then I would have to let it warm up for 2 or 3 minutes before I could even touch the throttle, otherwise it would die. With the WR250R, it's just pop off and go. It doesn't need any time to warm up, and there's nothing more to it. And not only that, but when you drop the DRZ, the carb floods out. So you pick the bike back up and you're just sitting there and cranking and cranking and cranking. Yeah. Sometimes it could be 2 to 3 minutes, and in one instance, it killed my battery and I was stranded because of it. And I eventually found a hill that I could bump start it and get it going again. So that's kind of a big deal in some cases. And one of the biggest ups that the WR has over the DRZ is that 6th gear. And the DRZ already has a close ratio gearbox, and with the torque that the bike has, they could have spread it out more and evened that out more, but the WR has a much wider ratio gearbox already. Even 1 through 5 is much wider. And they added a 6th gear, so you're cruising very low RPMs on the highway, interstate, whatever, and it's just very, very buttery smooth. It's a much more pleasant experience riding the WR on the highway and interstate than it is the DRZ. And yes, the WR will do interstate with me, a 280-pound ogre on it, so for any of you guys out there that are concerned about the power, it's not a deal-breaking issue. For some people it will be, though. One of the biggest issues I found with the DRZ, though, was how it carries its weight. It just always felt top-heavy when I was in slower technical terrain, but the WR feels very easy to control, and it's much more forgiving in close calls and technical environments. It's just a lot easier to ride. If any of you have ridden the CRF 450L or are interested in the CRF 450L, the WR250R handles very similar to that bike. As a matter of fact, it's almost identical in how it carries its weight. Now, the reason I said at the beginning why I think this bike is the best dual sport is because you can do everything with this bike. You can do interstate, you can do highway, fire roads, forest roads, you can even do single track with it, and it's fun on single track. I've been using this bike lately almost as a dedicated dirt bike, and lately it hasn't been seeing almost any road at all, and it's fun to ride on single track, whereas my DRZ was not fun to ride on single track. This bike just churns into corners and berms so much easier. The chassis is just set up better to take a lot more abuse. The suspension is way better than the DRZ was, and I mean honestly, the types of trails that my friend and I have been riding on with our WRs, we never see dual sports on. We only see like dedicated woods bikes like KTM 2-strokes or betas, and sometimes lately it's even been trials bikes, but we're out there with our WRs almost every weekend, and we've been riding these very technical trails, and the bikes just do great, and they keep coming back for more. And the best part about it is that I haven't changed my oil since the winter. And honestly, with how I've been riding my bike lately, I'm only going to need to do 1 oil change a season with the 3,000 mile interval, which means that I basically just have to keep my linkages greased and my bearings greased, and this bike is basically going to be maintenance free for me, besides the occasional fork rebuild or shock rebuild, which is every bike, especially if you ride them the way we have been lately. But it's like we get off of these trails, these gnarly trails, then it's a bike that I could just ride straight back home from the trail, wake up the next morning, take it to work, commute with it, maybe do a highway jaunt or an interstate jaunt to where I need to go, and then put it back in the garage. And then the weekend comes, and then I could do another gnarly trail or whatever. As long as you have the skills to do it, this bike will do anything you want it to, all while being extremely low maintenance compared to a dirt bike or a performance dual sport. And don't get me wrong, I loved my DRZ for what it was. It had a lot more power than this bike did down low, but this bike is just so much better for me and my type of riding that I do. And this bike is just so much easier to throw around on these tight trails than the DRZ is. Basically, the best way that I could put it about the WR versus DRZ is that the range of capabilities on the WR is much broader than what it is on the DRZ. Now I'm going to move on to what's probably the most controversial thing about this bike, and that would be the power. One thing I want to state about the power right away is that unless you're looking to change the sound of this bike, maybe just a decibel increase, please don't modify this bike. Don't waste your money doing it. Yamaha did a really good job squeezing almost every little bit of power that they could out of the motor, which means that there's not much there left for you to get out. Bikes like the DRZ, on the other hand, they benefit greatly from aftermarket mods like jetting and exhaust, whereas you go to throw a programmer on this bike, which, let's just start out, that costs $200 by itself. Even with a pipe and a header, you're only looking at maybe a 2 horsepower increase, 3 to 4 at most, and that's if you're lucky. Not to mention the fact that when you put a fuel controller on the bike, it's just another point of failure. The best power mod that you could do to this bike, hands down, would be gearing. The lower you gear it, the more torque you are going to have, which makes it great for off-road. And that stock pipe is nice and quiet. It's nice to ride through the woods with. It's not going to piss the DNR off, not going to piss any cops off, and it's going to leave your wallet happy. Now remember, I'm 6'7", 280 pounds, and I think this bike has enough power for me. Whether it will not have enough power for you or not is going to be entirely up to you and your needs of the bike. It hauls me at interstate speed, which for those of you that don't know is 70 to 80 miles per hour depending on where you are. It hauls me just fine at that speed. You're not going to be passing cars, but it does what it needs to do. And don't get me wrong, riding at those speeds is not fun at all. I didn't even enjoy doing it on my FJ09. But the bike can do it, and it will do it all day if you need it to. Now just regular highway speeds like 55, you can pass cars. You need a little bit more space to get to where you need to go, but it gets the job done. Now like going up big hills and stuff like that at higher speeds like 60 to 70, yeah, you have to downshift, but it's like I said, that motor likes to be wrung out. You have to wring it out to get the most out of it. And even when it's screaming at 11,000 RPMs, the motor is still not vibrating that much. Now on twisty back roads and stuff like that, that's a different story. Leaning this bike all the way over and wringing it out is just an absolute blast. I can't even imagine how much fun this bike would be in a supermoto setup. Basically, my thoughts on the roadworthiness of this bike comes down to this. I enjoy dirt riding more. The roads are more just to connect trails for me than anything. I don't enjoy road riding, even with the sport bikes that I've had. The road bikes, I just don't enjoy it as much as I like riding in the dirt. Basically, if the bike does it and gets it done comfortably, which I think this bike absolutely does, it gets a thumbs up in my book. But if I had to put a basis for comparison, I honestly think this bike is better on the street than my KLR 650 was. There's just less vibrations, it just handles better, and it's just an overall more fun experience in general. Now granted, the weight of the KLR would really help with highway work, but even still, it's like I said before, I'm more of a dirt rider at heart, so that extra weight's only going to hurt me when I get to the trail. The bike does have almost 30 horsepower, but it's how it makes its power is the reason why people think it doesn't have enough. The bike makes its power sort of like a 125 two-stroke. That you have very little in the bottom end. It's enough to keep you rolling and it's enough to get you going, even without gas. But it's very little power in the beginning and then it just builds and builds and builds and builds and then boom, you have almost 30 horsepower. And this is at 10 or 11,000 RPMs. This bike just screams. Now for beginner riders that are looking to get into the off-road scene, that small amount of low-end torque that the bike has will make it a lot harder for beginners to start practicing enduro techniques because you need a lot more finesse with the clutch on this bike because it doesn't have that punch down low that something like, say, a DRZ does. So even simple enduro techniques like hopping a log or a small obstacle require a lot more clutch input from the rider than something like a DRZ 400 does. But that's not a bad thing. It doesn't matter what bike you use, when you get into harder dual sport and enduro riding, the harder the terrain gets, the more clutch you'll be using. Now, one thing I want to make perfectly clear is that if you don't like wringing a bike out, you need to consider a different bike. This bike makes max power at 10 or 11,000 RPMs, and if you are uncomfortable with hitting that number, you need to buy a different bike. Part of the naming of WR, wide ratio, includes the fact that this bike has such a long RPM range. Yamaha intentionally designed it this way, and this motor is based off of the R1 motor, so it has the technology and tolerances to be screaming at 11,000 RPMs all day long. So you can do it, and it's not going to hurt the motor, I promise you on that. Now that we've got that out of the way, I want to talk about my two favorite parts about this bike, and that would be the chassis and the suspension. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the stock suspension is not the best, but it's good, especially for the price point that this bike is at. But the best part about the suspension is the fact that it has a very good upgrade path. You can easily find springs for both front and back online. No matter what size rider you are, no matter how much weight you're going to be carrying, it's easy to find valving kits for the front and rear. It's easy to find guides on how to rebuild and upgrade. It's easy to send in your stuff. There are shops that are tailored specifically to this bike and doing suspension work to this bike because it's so easy to work on in that aspect, and it's so easy to upgrade. And then my favorite part about the bike, hands down, and especially coming from a DRZ, is the chassis. This bike is just so well balanced. Like standing up in slow terrain doing really, really technical stuff, it feels just like a dirt bike. It rolls just like a dirt bike, handles just like a dirt bike. Albeit it feels like a dirt bike with 50 extra pounds, but it still feels like a dirt bike. Especially when compared to my DRZ, which felt extremely top heavy compared to this. The bike always just felt like it wanted to fall over when you were in slower technical terrain. It's just not as easy to ride. It's still great, and it's still close to a dirt bike experience, but it's just not on the same level as the WR. I mean, I know the weight figures between the two are only like 20 to 25 pounds off from each other, something like that, but the WR feels like it's 50 to 60 pounds lighter than the DRZ, and just how it feels at almost a standstill when you're standing up. And I know you guys, it sounds like I'm ragging on the DRZ, and I'm really not. I'm just trying to be critical between the two to help you guys make a decision. I know I was in a place where I really could have been told the things that I wanted to, and I'm just trying to help you guys out. Especially since I've owned these bikes both for a couple years. I just want to give you guys my opinion and my experiences with them firsthand. But I will be the first to admit that the WR is not without fault. There's a few little things about this bike that I absolutely cannot stand. The first being that when you change gearing, your speed on the speedometer changes since the sensor is inside the transmission instead of like on the DRZ where it's on the front wheel. So unless you spend $100 to $200 on some part to correct your speed, it's going to stay 10 to 15, maybe 20 to 25 miles an hour ahead depending on how you have it geared. And then there's also the front fairing designs off the tank, the gas tank. It's like a two-piece plastic design, and they break constantly. It is the stupidest design I've ever seen on a dirt bike, dual sport, whatever. The moment you drop your bike in the dirt, even if it's a soft drop, and that fairing makes contact with the ground, it breaks from the inside plastic. I have no clue why they chose to design it that way. Even their YZ and WR dirt bike line doesn't have that type of plastic. It just baffles me. And then the last one is a little bit more nitpicky, but it's still I use it every day, so it annoys me. The turn signal switches. The button is just really, really mushy pushing it back and forth. It's really mushy pushing it in. There's no like firm tactile feedback coming from it. And this is, I've tried it on new bikes at dealerships. I don't know what it is with the turn signal buttons on this bike, but they just suck. I really think I said about all I could about this bike. If you guys have any questions or need to know anything about this bike, for instance, just shoot me a PM or comment on this video. I really appreciate you all watching this, and I really appreciate the feedback that I've been getting on my other videos. Thank you guys for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day.